W5. A brutal murder leads to a sudden arrest.
I got picked up. They put the cuffs on me, then that was that.
That leaves friends and families reeling.
The man that I know is not a murderer.
Did the justice system convict an innocent man?
How can you accuse me of something like this?
Avery Haines investigates a murder case with unanswered questions.
Brian Anderson didn't have a lawyer when he was being interrogated by the police.
A problematic trial.
That's a recipe for a wrongful conviction right there.
Suspicions of bias and racism.
It is an unforgiving system that's dangerous.
And one man's fight for the truth.
I want to live to see freedom.
And Canada's first teenage heartthrob. Looks, charm, a golden voice,
This, my darling, I've been told.
and staying power.
61 years I've been doing this, folks.
Beverly Thompson meets with a musical living legend.
It all starts with the piano.
A singer, songwriter, actor, and family man
You know, I'm never gonna stop doing this.
whose legacy has inspired many
Paul was one of the giants whose shoulders I stood upon.
and will never slow down.
You don't stop doing something you're passionate about.
Here is Kevin Newman.
Hello, and thanks for joining us. We're launching all new investigations this week with the troubling story of a man who has spent his entire adult life insisting he did not commit a murder he was convicted of as a teenager. There were plenty of reasons to believe Brian Anderson 4 decades ago when W5 first brought his story to light. In all that time since, the criminal justice system has failed to examine strong evidence suggesting the wrong man went to jail. So Avery Haines revisited him and discovered that he is no longer alone in fighting to clear his name.
This is where Brian Anderson finds peace. Running outside on his own. One foot in front of the other. It's where he feels the most free. But Brian Anderson is not a free man.
I want to live to see freedom. I want freedom. That's what I want.
For 45 years, he's been fighting for that freedom.
I wish I could just let it go. I can't let it go. I've been wronged. It's like the saying goes, the first cut is the deepest, you know? It's where the wrongs started. And you can't undo it.
Where the wrongs started for Brian was at this intersection in downtown Winnipeg in the summer of 1973. The body of a 40-year-old man named Ting Fong Chan was found on the sidewalk. He'd been beaten, stabbed, and left for dead. One witness described seeing a group of men with long hair near the murder scene. And within days, police focused on a group of suspects, 4 young Indigenous men. One of those men was Brian Anderson. Brian was just 18. He was the oldest boy in a family of 10 kids who grew up on the Fairford Reserve, about 200 kilometers north of Winnipeg.
They always knew he didn't do this.
Dorothy Anderson is Brian's younger sister.
He was a role model for us too, and a protector. He was there a lot of times when my parents weren't home. He would sort of be looking after the rest of us.
In 1972, Brian left his family behind and moved to Winnipeg.
I heard Winnipeg would be the place to find work. So I came to the city. Found work right away. I had no problem.
You must have kind of felt like you had it made. You left your community, but you came to the big city, you're making money.
Yeah. Well, I was happy because I have work, you know? That's what I wanted.
Brian worked at Canadian hide exporters, hauling and weighing cow hides. He'd make regular trips back to the reserve, proudly sharing his hard-earned money.
He used to bring my mom gifts. I remember he brought her a curling iron one time, and then another time he brought her a wall hanging after having a job for that few months.
But Brian's life changed forever on one of those visits home to Fairford, when police showed up at his parents' house asking for Brian.
My mom said, like, police are here to see you. I got picked up, and they didn't say anything until I got into the car, and they put the cuffs on me. Said, city police wants to see you. And then that was that. Nobody said anything.
Brian thought he was in trouble for an unpaid ticket, but as he was being escorted back to Winnipeg, his family was blindsided by devastating news.
We didn't know what was going on. And then that's when my dad came in. And then he told us that my brother had killed somebody. I was shocked. I didn't believe it. And my dad was crying, so I knew it was serious.
Brian was taken to Winnipeg Police Headquarters and put in an interrogation room.
So they turned me over to the city police. They told me, okay, we have witnesses. We're investigating a murder here, and you're involved in it.
And when they said to you, you're wanted for murder,
yeah,
what were you thinking?
I didn't believe them.
Winnipeg police had charged 3 other men, Alan, Clarence, and Russell Woodhouse, with the random murder of Ting Fong Chan, a cook at a downtown restaurant who was walking home from the night shift. Police told Brian his friends had confessed to the murder, and they said he was with them.
They were persistent that they had witnesses. We have witnesses saying that you were there.
And you're saying I wasn't there?
That's right, I wasn't there. Like, I do know these people, but I wasn't with them.
Brian says police placed some papers in front of him and told him if he wanted his belongings back, he needed to sign for them. He claims he didn't know he was signing a confession. It would end up becoming key evidence, in fact, the only evidence in the case against him. All 4 young men pleaded not guilty. But the jury didn't believe them and handed down 4 guilty verdicts in March of 1974.
I'm hoping that you can think back to you as a young man sitting in the courtroom, and you hear the words guilty, and then you hear life in prison.
Mm-hmm. It was a shocker. It was just unbelievable. Like, how can you accuse me of something like this? I didn't do this.
There is no way that anyone can look at this conviction and say, Brian Anderson had a fair trial. Do we lose it somewhat? Can we summarize it better?
Jerome Kennedy is a lawyer for Innocence Canada, an organization that works to exonerate people who've been wrongfully convicted. A year ago, Jerome and his team started looking into Brian's case.
So I'm reviewing this file, and for 40 years, this man has maintained he's innocent. And then, as we're going through the file further, we discover there's references in the file that W5 had done a story on the Brian Anderson case.
Brian Anderson is a 22-year-old Indian. Anderson is serving a life sentence for murder.
In 1978, Brian Anderson's troubling case was the focus of this W5 story.
But Brian Anderson claims he did not commit the crime, had no part in it, was not even present at the scene.
I didn't believe there was such a crime like that. I never even heard about it, somebody getting killed.
Back then, W5 interviewed Brian's teacher in prison, who was advocating on his behalf.
And I said, look, Anderson, I'm sure you can still get off with this if you plead manslaughter. I'll never forget it. He looked me straight in the eye and said, Mr. Skelding, if I do that, that means I killed somebody. I never killed a person.
That W5 story raised serious doubts about Brian Anderson's guilt way back in 1978, but nothing came of it. He stayed behind bars.
How do you make the days and the years go by in prison?
You just have to make the best of it. Whichever, for me, I was reading. I go work out, I go for my jogs. Try to be by myself most of the time. It's not easy to just forget where you are. You can't. It's impossible.
Brian Anderson spent a decade behind bars, much of it here at the Stony Mountain Institution in Manitoba. W5 has obtained access to his prison file. In it, he's described as a model prisoner. He got his high school diploma, picked up some university credits, and even learned a trade. But what's most interesting about what's in this file is that again and again, Brian Anderson says he didn't do it. He didn't kill anyone. And the prison warden at the time went so far as to say that Brian had an obsession with his innocence. Year after year, there are psychiatric evaluations, inmate reports, warden notes, filled with Brian's claims of innocence.
There's been a lot written about me.
Yeah.
This is the first time Brian has seen those records.
This is from the National Parole Board in 1980.
Including this letter denying him temporary parole because the board felt the risk that he would violate such a release to establish his innocence and possibly contact witnesses is too high. 4 years later, in 1984, Brian was released on parole. He moved to Winnipeg and moved on with his life. He fell in love, got married, and had a child.
I thought he was a very handsome man, and we started talking and started dating. He just had a warmthness about him.
Lillian Anderson and Brian were married for 29 years. They're separated now, but remain close and share a daughter, Whitney.
I think that he gave me the best childhood that he could provide. He was the one that I remember playing with on, the living room floor, watching Disney movies together.
Whitney remembers the day that her parents sat her down to tell her about her dad's past.
I think I was probably about 9 years old. They basically told me, your dad went to jail for something that he didn't do.
Did you feel like you were living with this big dark secret through your teens, through your life?
Well, it's not something that you really want to talk about. It's not something like growing up I would tell my friends. It's not something that you really want to share with people just because the fear of people not believing in him.
It was hard for both of them. We tried not to think about it. We knew it was there, she knew it was there. Parole officers would come around all the time.
Even now, Brian is still on parole. He has regular check-ins and can't travel 100 kilometers beyond Winnipeg without approval.
Can you give it to Papa?
His daughter Whitney still gets calls from parole officers checking up on her dad.
He's never known to be free as an adult person. Sorry. The man that I know, the man that I married, the man that I had a child with, is not a murderer.
A long fight against a tough system.
Police don't lie. Aboriginal kids do.
Leaves one man claiming innocence.
Your lawyer never called your alibi?
Never did.
When W5 continues.
"63-year-old Brian Anderson was convicted of murder in the early 1970s. He spent 10 years in prison and is currently on parole. But he has always maintained he is innocent.
I like the idea of presenting Brian Anderson's evidence in full.
Innocence Canada is working on an application to the Minister of Justice, asking for his case to be reviewed. A move like this is often a last resort for lawyers after all other avenues have been exhausted.
We believe Brian is innocent. I come across this and I go, wait now. 4 Indigenous youth, the Winnipeg Police Service, and George Dangerfield? Man, that's a recipe for a wrongful conviction right there.
George Dangerfield, for you, the alarm bells are going off.
Mr. Dangerfield has the unfortunate record of being the Crown prosecutor who's responsible for the conviction of most innocent men in this country.
Dangerfield was a top Manitoba prosecutor for 30 years. To date, 4 of his convictions for murder have been overturned. He's seen here testifying at an inquiry into one of those wrongful convictions.
Yes, I'm sorry he put all that time in prison, but I didn't intentionally try to get him into prison.
Once Innocence Canada knew Dangerfield was the prosecutor in Brian's case, they started digging into the evidence the Crown used to get that conviction. They learned there was no physical evidence linking Brian to the crime, and that the only eyewitness testimony police relied on was questionable.
The only evidence that places Brian Anderson in the area of where Mr. Chan's body was found was that of Adam Woodhouse.
Adam Woodhouse claims all 4 men, including Brian Anderson, were together at his home near the murder scene the night of the crime. But that key evidence was contradicted.
Both the wife and the daughter, in their statements to the police and in their testimony at trial, said Brian Anderson wasn't there that night. That coincided exactly with what Brian Anderson initially told the police. I wasn't there that night.
2 people say Brian was not with the others that night. In fact, Brian even had an alibi. He says he was at his grandfather's the night of the murder.
Did that ever come up in court?
I think it was brought up, but they never did bring out my grandfather to come testify on our behalf.
Your lawyer never called your alibi?
Never did.
And at the time, you didn't think, well, my lawyer should be calling the one person who can say he couldn't have done it, he was with me.
I didn't know the court system back then. I had no idea.
That's one of the systemic issues that we've seen arise in wrongful convictions over the last 20 years, is that an accused person gives an alibi, his family or friends who are most likely the people to give an alibi, it's dismissed outright. No one believes it because the police tell the truth, accused lie.
But police behavior in the Anderson case was the focus of this CTV Winnipeg story from the late 1970s. 2 of the men convicted alongside Brian were interviewed about their claims of police brutality.
Now, when they were questioning you, did they rough you up at all? Did they handle you? Did they hit you or push you?
Yeah, they hit me.
Where were you slapped?
Across the face, bridge of the nose, more like.
And did it cause any damage?
It caused my nose to bleed.
But the fact remains that the system of justice in Manitoba broke down in this instance. And if justice is to be done, rather than seem to be done, it's imperative that this case be reopened.
The case was never reopened, despite those brutality allegations, and despite the fact that in Brian's case, there was an alibi, conflicting eyewitness reports, and no physical evidence linking him to the crime. W5 requested an interview with Winnipeg's chief of police. The police service declined, saying the chief was in no position to comment on the merits of a 45-year-old case.
Brian Anderson didn't have a lawyer when he was being interrogated by the police. He had a grade 6 education. In fact, he barely spoke English. But Innocence Canada's application isn't just about challenging the evidence against him. And this could be precedent-setting. They're arguing that systemic racism played a role in both his arrest and his conviction.
The way this trial was conducted is startling in terms of the way these Indigenous young men were treated. It established clearly in my mind, police don't lie, Aboriginal kids do. Prosecutor does everything properly, Aboriginal kids are guilty. Brian Anderson was an easy target. Didn't take long for the police to close this file. It's just the classic example of police tunnel vision.
I want to read you something that the judge said at Brian Anderson's trial. This is not a jungle. This is not wild land. We are no longer taking land from wild people. This is our country. What does that say to you?
It's absolutely unbelievable in terms of today's context. I'm sure that people sitting in the courtroom that day probably weren't even startled by those comments. What's happened in the last number of years in Canada, where there's more of a recognition that racism and systemic racism exists in the system.
We're going to go over there and get organized, and then we're going to get out there.
Mitch Bourbonniere works with Indigenous men who were involved in the criminal justice system in Winnipeg.
Does what happened to Brian Anderson surprise you?
No, it doesn't surprise me. I'm still working with 20-year-old young men that are racialized, that are impoverished, that are not being given opportunity, that are being discriminated against, that don't understand their rights. It is an unforgiving system that's dangerous.
Do you believe it's even more dangerous for Indigenous people?
Absolutely. Unequivocally. Absolutely.
Innocence Canada is hopeful that filing this application will eventually set right what they believe is an historic wrong.
This is a chance to stand up and to admit that the Canadian criminal justice system went wrong and that Brian Anderson should be given another chance.
David Lametti is the Minister of Justice responsible for the Criminal Conviction Review Group. He can't comment on Brian's case because it's currently under review. But in a statement to W5, the Department of Justice said priority is usually given to applicants who are in custody and that the process can take a number of months or years.
All right.
And so Brian waits. But now he's not alone. At Innocence Canada's 5th annual Wrongful Conviction Day reception, Brian is welcomed by a club that no one wants to be a part of, Canada's wrongfully convicted. Thomas Sofino, James Driscoll, Ron Dalton, people who know all too well what it's like to fight for their freedom.
It's an amazing case of perseverance of an individual who says, I am going to clear my name at all costs.
For 45 years, Brian Anderson has been trying to clear his name. His daughter Whitney is in awe of his resilience.
I'm so surprised with the man that my dad is and has turned out to be, because having to go through that, you know, that could really, really damage a person.
It could have destroyed him.
It could have, and it didn't. And I'm very proud of my dad, and I want for his grandkids to be proud of him as well.
I need my freedom. I have to have my freedom. I was put in this world too, to live a free life like everybody else.
The 3 other men who were convicted alongside Brian Anderson have also served their time. Russell Woodhouse has since died. Alan and Clarence Woodhouse now live in Western Canada.